We appreciate very much the presentation that's been given. And we're going to open the questions for questions and answers. Keep your questions brief. It's not your turn to get up and give a talk. If you have a comment, you may make a comment. Just raise your hand. I will call on you. And make sure you hold the mic up so that you can be recorded and that everybody can hear the question that is asked. So, are there any questions or comments that anyone has?
It's good to hear you, Marcus.
Thank you.
I don't know if I was listening fast enough, but you were talking about angelic languages, and you were talking about Job's daughters.
Mm-hmm.
Were you saying that you thought that was...
Yeah, I thought that was an example of a language because it says that they were speaking angelic languages or angelic utterances.
Well, I think you need to maybe relook at that. That's talking about, or that's from a book that was a modification of the book of Job that was written in about somewhere between 100 BC and 100 AD. It's not recognized as inspired by anybody.
Okay.
And besides all of that, I really don't think, well, I don't know how to say this exactly, but in the passage in 1 Corinthians 13, and I don't want to steal Jason's thunder here, but this voice of angel, of these tongues of men and of angels, I think that's a hyperbole, or it's an exaggeration for a point of emphasis. Though I spoke in every tongue that is known, is the idea. And you have a similar hyperbole over in Galatians 1 and 8, where he says, though we are an angel from heaven, speak unto you any other doctrine than we have already taught, let him be accursed. It's not like Paul is expecting an angel to start preaching some other doctrine. He's just using that as an exaggeration. If any person, which he goes on to say in the next verse, if anyone, even an angel, were to say something different from the gospel, he would accept that. But he's not really expecting an angel to say something. And the word tongues and languages, they're used interchangeably. In Acts chapter 2, verse 4, you have tongues. In verse 6, you have languages. In verse 11, you have tongues. And they're used interchangeably, and they're always human languages.
Okay.
So you might want to reconsider that point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.
You're welcome.
My comment is along the same of what Alan is speaking.
Okay.
I doubt there's any need to speculate in verse 10 that we have an ecstatic utterance. The word for tongues is the same word that we're going to have back on the day of Pentecost. The idea of interpreting an ecstatic utterance makes little or no sense. And we have to think that on the day of Pentecost, think of the universality of the population, and for that reason we would not have necessarily a need of interpretation. But in the local situation at Corinth, there would be a need of interpretation. There's probably no need to speculate and try to bring forth the idea of an ecstatic utterance in the word tongues in that verse. That's just an added comment.
So 14:2, when it says, and though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries, and though I have all faith that not the right passage. 14:2, for he who speaks a tongue does not speak to men, but to God, for no one understands him. However, in the spirit he speaks mysteries. Can you help me kind of understand that with the idea of tongues? 14.
That'll come up this afternoon.
Oh, okay.
I think maybe.
Go ahead.
Just one thought. He's speaking to God, in the language the audience doesn't understand. The only way he can be edified is he's speaking in a language he understands. And then in turn, to speak so the audience knows his understanding, there will be an interpreter.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Marcus. This 31st verse right here is translated most of the time as an imperative, the word desire. But if it's my understanding that in that particular verse, the word zelao that's being translated desired could be the indicative mood rather than the imperative mood, which would make this a statement rather than a command. And so if it was taken as a statement, the verse would be saying, you are desiring the greater gifts, but I'm going to show you something better. But the way that's translated there, it makes it look like this is a command. I am commanding you to seek the best gifts. And it looks to me like the indicative mood fits the context better, because the very next chapter, he starts to explain the better way than seeking the best gifts would be a spirit of love for one another. I just wondered if you had run across that and if you had a position on it.
I did briefly, but I couldn't say that I fully had time to study out the indicative and imperative idea, but I did run across it, and I remember reading it, and that makes sense, what you said.
Just a comment, Marcus. Appreciate the study. And on verse 8, when you brought out the issue there on the wisdom of God, and the wisdom, the spirit of wisdom, I appreciate the background you gave there on the congregation of Corinth and folks from all different walks of life, but especially the Jew and the Gentile. And when you kind of think of that and relate that to what's going on with the church, I think one of the couple of verses that really kind of pull that thought about the wisdom and the depth of the wisdom together is when you keep in mind basically that you just have the wisdom of God and the wisdom of the world, or in other words, just two kingdoms. And when you look at it like that, then when you consider it along with like Romans 11:33, the depth of the riches of both of the wisdom and the knowledge, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. It shows the divine part of the part of God. And then when we actually look at what Paul began addressing the Corinthians with in 1 Corinthians 1:21 and 24, he talks about after the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. And so we see the separation of those two components to the wisdom. The reason that becomes important is, as we know, the church in verse 24 of chapter 1, 1 Corinthians 1:24, he says, but unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and wisdom of God. So again, we see that separation there of addressing both audiences, Jew and Gentile, or Jew and Greek, with the wisdom of God. Last, I just wanted to mention to kind of tie that together for our benefit today, and that we remember Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10. To the intent that now unto the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be made known by the church the manifold wisdom of God. So what we have is the early stages of the spiritual gifts of the manifold wisdom of God being revealed to the Corinthians.
This isn't a question, but just a statement in general. I would appreciate it if speakers would say what version of the Bible they're going to be using.
Okay.
Thank you. Marcus, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to make?
Well, just thank you for the opportunity to, present. And I know that I learned a lot from the study. I was very uplifted and encouraged by the advice that Paul gave them. We see that they were all unified, even though they were all from different backgrounds and different bodies and different shapes. And we see that the gifts that they had were all to glorify God, which is another amazing insight that I received from that passage. So I pray that today that we, learn from them and, of course, glorify God in all of our actions and thoughts and behaviors, the way that we treat one another, the way that we carry ourselves. And, we believe that the body will function the way that God designed if we do that very thing. So, again, thank you for your time, and thank you for your questions and comments as well.
Okay, thank you.